Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest updates from the front line, especially around the Ukrainian offensive, but also generally about the developments elsewhere. So starting out in the past day, the Ukrainian forces have continued their attacks. However, a very interesting news report has come out, and that is from the NSDC Secretary Danilov from the Ukrainian army, where he essentially says that the Ukrainian strategy with this offensive has changed. Their aim is now on exhausting the Russian army and not on moving forward, which explains the lack of advances on this part of the front line. And it also reflects on what we are seeing on the front line. Generally, what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces have changed their strategy from launching armored columns or generally trying to move through the forest patches, whether it be with armored vehicles or with the infantry, has generally stopped or has been significantly limited. In exchange, we've seen a few more attempts at counterattacks by the Russian forces, but most importantly, the Ukrainian forces have mainly switched to a sort of combat operation where they focus more on engaging the Russians rather than trying to advance. We have seen also in the footage that we receive from the front line that the losses have generally changed from Ukrainian vehicles and Ukrainian soldiers to Russian vehicles and Russian soldiers, and in exchange we have seen more Ukrainian artillery being hit in comparison to vehicles and infantry. There's of course still videos of infantry and vehicles, but it is now mainly artillery pieces. Over the past few days we have seen multiple M777s and also other systems, and also air defense systems being hit on the Ukrainian side. This indicates that the Russians have already switched to adapt to the Ukrainian change in strategy, where they're now focusing mainly on counter battery activities, launching their drones to attack the Ukrainian artillery, and generally trying to limit the Ukrainian ability to launch this sort of attritional strategy to cut down the Russian forces on this part. Essentially, what I believe brought on this change of strategy is that the Ukrainian forces still have not reached the main line of defense of the Russian forces, their first line of defense across the whole Zaporizhzhia front. And with that, they have realized that if they cannot reach it, then it will be way more difficult to break through it than it is breaking through these initial frontline positions by the Russian forces. So they're essentially thinking the best way to then win on this part of the front line and launch a successful offensive is to cut down the Russian forces prior to reaching the defensive line, so that once they reach the defensive line, there will be more weaknesses there rather than on this current part of the front line. So they're essentially trying to bait the Russians to send troops to the front line, try to make them launch some counterattacks so that they can cut down the amount of Russian troops on this part of the front line, which would allow them to discover openings or just generally wait for the Russians to make a mistake so that they can launch a successful spearhead, because they still have their spearhead sitting and waiting for an opening. So far it has not appeared. This is why they're trying to change their strategy so that they're able to essentially develop or create an opening so that they're able to launch their main spearhead attack, which would allow them to potentially break through the Russian defensive line. However, we are also still seeing some attacks. This is to essentially allow the Russian forces to reveal themselves, which will then allow the Ukrainian forces to strike them. So they're essentially trying to launch some attacks to force the Russians to reveal themselves. So of these attacks, we have seen them come from both from Orhiv and also from Huliaipole in the direction of the village of Polohi, which is to the south of Huliaipole and to the east of Orhiv. So they are attacking in these two directions towards this village. Then we are also seeing attacks further eastwards by the Vremevsky Ledge, south of Velika Novosilka. These are all attacks to the east towards the west of the river line, and in the western parts down south towards Staromayorsk and Priotne, as they try to reach these villages and attack in these positions. So essentially they're still putting a lot of pressure up by the front line. However, they're not committing to these probing attacks or to these initial attacks, and they're instead trying to force the Russian forces to reveal themselves so that they can launch their own strikes on these positions. The issue here would be essentially if the Russians are just able to resupply and reinforce the lost positions whenever the Ukrainians cut them down or launch their attacks on these Russian positions. So the Ukrainian forces are consistently attacking and trying to prevent the Russian supply lines from working properly. They attack with both Storm Shadow missiles, saboteurs, and so on to essentially cut down or limit the supplies going to and from this part of the front line. So they're especially trying to hit here in the roads between Berdyansk and Polohi. So essentially what they're doing is that they want to cut the supplies on this eastern part, and at the same time they want to limit the supplies coming from Crimea towards Kherson, because the Russians have gathered a lot of supplies in the Crimea Peninsula. And this is why we saw the strikes on the bridges here to the north of Crimea. I have not received any updates on whether or not these are repaired or what has happened to them, but essentially some were sabotaged with some Storm Shadow missiles of the French variant. So the Ukrainian forces are trying to hit the back line, trying to hit the supply lines, and at the same time they're trying to grind down the Russian forces. And in connection with this, the latest UK Ministry of Defense intelligence update, they write, although Russia has achieved some success with this approach to the early stages of Ukraine's counteroffensive, its forces continue to suffer from key weaknesses, especially overstretched units and a shortage of artillery munitions. So the issue I see here with this conclusion is, first of all, their argument that Russia has overstretched units doesn't hold up, because the first line of defense of the Russian forces, the main line of defense, the Zaporizhzhia line, this is all located away from the front line, which means that the Ukrainian forces have not reached this line, and the main Russian force is by this line. They are not ahead of it. These are only contingents of Russian troops ahead of it. The main forces are by the first defensive line. So unless the Ukrainians reach this line and then do not realize or detect large amounts of Russian troops, or that the Russian troops are overstretched, then I'll believe in that conclusion. But until then, I cannot believe in such a conclusion, because so far we've only seen contingents of Russian troops launching counterattacks whenever the Ukrainians launch attacks. So this is why we're seeing some sort of quote-unquote overstretch of Russian troops, because it's the same units moving from the different parts of the front line, conducting counterattacks whenever the Ukrainian forces launch their own attacks. The second part, which is the shortage of artillery, again, Zaluzhny and his article where he claimed the Russians are shooting 10 artillery shells to every single Ukrainian artillery shell. If this is true, then if the Russians are lacking ammunition, then what is Ukraine lacking if they're only doing a tenth of what Russia is doing? Of course, there's always the possibility that Zaluzhny is quote-unquote lying to try and do some psyop operation to make the Russians believe that they are weaker than they actually are, and all of that stuff, similar to how Prigozhin kept saying we have no ammunition, our flanks are weak, all of these things to try and make the Ukrainians attack. So this could be a similar operation trying to do a reverse card. There's always a possibility. But nonetheless, the Russians can see for themselves if they are getting hit by artillery or not. If the Russians are actually shooting 10-1 artillery strikes on the Ukrainian forces, then most likely the Ukrainians do not have the capacity to match that output, which means that the Russian forces have a significant advantage here. Now, there are a lot of videos about the war, the frontline losses on both sides. I'll just go through them very quickly, spontaneously, going over the titles of the different video footages, and then you can check them out in depth on my Telegram channel. So essentially, we're seeing some different drones flying over different areas. We see armored vehicles being hit by artillery strikes, airstrikes, tanks, vehicles, everything getting destroyed by different drones, mostly kamikaze drones, but also Ka-52 helicopters and so on. We see a Ukrainian artillery strike on a Russian tank. We see a Russian tank driving through a mine. The crew survives, leaves the tank, taking with them their own equipment, both their body armor and also their weapons, as they try to leave and go to the side. We see different drones hitting different tanks on both sides. We see HIMARS attack on Russian armored vehicles and artillery. We see multiple Russian helicopters, Ka-52 and Mi-28, launching attacks on Ukrainian positions. We see a lot of rocket fire, a lot of artillery fire, a lot of aircraft, airstrikes. We see a lot of different footages from the different parts of the front line. And all of this is the daily, day-to-day activities of both sides. We see constant fighting. Although we do not see the front line moving a lot, the casualties on both sides are enormous. Over these past weeks of constant fighting, especially with the amount of weaponry the Russian forces have started to use in comparison to Bakhmut, or even the first half a year to a year of the war, the Russian forces were not using nearly as much as they're using right now. The extensive use of their air force, and especially their helicopters, the amount of usage of their artillery systems, the multi-launch rocket systems, and all of these systems allowed them to inflict heavy casualties. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are trying to decrease the amount of casualties they receive by changing their strategies and adapting to the situation. However, the Russians also are rapidly adapting, as they have many more opportunities and many more strategies available to them due to the significant amount and advantage of both artillery shells, but also air force they have in comparison to the Ukrainian forces. They're able to just make use of all of this to achieve a major success throughout this offensive. The Ukrainians have only been able to recapture 8 villages across the Zaporizhia front. They've made some progress south and north of Bakhmut as well, but again here they have not even managed to capture a single village. Ukrainians are generally receiving a lot of losses, as well as the Russians, but the Ukrainians even more, and they're not really gaining that much in return. So it is a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians right now, and they definitely seem to have to constantly change their operations to figure out what is working, similar to what Zaluzhny said in an earlier interview. When the Russians initially started the war, the Ukrainians just tried a bunch of different strategies until they found out what worked, and then they did that until the Russians were forced to retreat. We most likely see something similar now. The Ukrainians will try to continuously adapt and think of new strategies so that they're able to respond to the Russian forces and potentially launch a major spearhead that will break through the Russian defenses. But so far it seems that that is still far from the current situation, as there's no clear evidence of the Russian artillery strikes, air force and so on decreasing, while the Ukrainian forces are continuously taking losses in exchange for these minute gains. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and make sure to check me out on Patreon, and the PayPal link will be down in the description. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.